and I will allow them to introduce themselves.
Okay, I'll begin. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Katlyn Carter. I'm an assistant professor of history at Notre Dame. I'm finishing up a book right now about secrecy in politics during the Revolutionary era. And I teach classes on the American Constitution, the American Revolution, and early American history. So I'm excited to discuss this with all of you.
I'm Monica Tetzlaff, and I teach history at Indiana University South Bend. I'm an associate professor of history, and my fields of specialty are African American history, women's history, and the history of the African subcontinent. So I'm excited to talk about these subjects in relation to 1619.
And I'm Darryl Heller. I direct the IU South Bend Civil Rights Heritage Center, and I'm an assistant professor in Women and Gender Studies program at IU South Bend. I particularly work on issues around the history of race and race construction and the reconstruction of race, as well as the intersection of race and gender.
Thank you, and thank you very much to our panelists for being here with us tonight. So to start with a question for the panel, the author of the 1619 project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, has an undergraduate degree in history, but has spent her professional career as an award-winning journalist. So should we read the 1619 project primarily as a journalistic or a historical work? And I have a couple questions here, so feel free to address any or all in your opening comments here. Should we evaluate journalism differently than we evaluate history writing? And then if you could speak a little bit about how that historical debate that might be more academic, how does that translate into the current controversy that we're seeing around the 1619 project in kind of the popular media? Start at the other end, sure.
Sure, I'll start. So the question is, as I think about it, what's important to realize is history is not written just by historians. I mean, we like to think that we have a little particular niche in this market, you know, like we go to school for it, we study it, and we think about it a lot, and we get trained in a particular methodology. But people don't always learn their history by reading the kinds of books that we as historians write. They get their history from social media, they get it from, you know, their neighbor, they get it from magazines, they get it from journalists, and then they adapt it or adopt it in whatever way they do. And there's often, or I should say that what historians like to pride ourselves in is not fully objectivity, because I don't think that there's any such thing as objectivity. Like historians, as well as everybody else, writes from a particular perspective or bias or, you know, a set of experiences. And there's a really good, useful book that I really like, written by a Haitian anthropologist, actually, called Silencing the Past. And what he talks about in that is, you know, is like our positionality. It really kind of follows us a lot in terms of even the sources we choose. I mean, we pick and choose different sources, and there's silences. There's always silences in there, and so kind of being aware of that is important. And I think journalists have written, some of the best history out there. And they generally tend to write much more clear than historians, in a way that's much more accessible. But regardless of who's doing history, who's writing it, who's researching it, there are some standards that have to be maintained, I think, to be credible. And you have to really be able to document sources. I mean, we as historians are driven primarily by primary sources, first instances of when something is said or written in the context in which it's said and written. And good journalists will do the same. They'll lean on or lead with primary sources as well versus secondary, third, or tertiary sources, as we call them. But it's like hearsay. Like, I'm going to write this as the truth because I heard someone else say it, versus I'm going to go right to the source of the person who actually said it and try to understand and interpret that. versus what someone else said they said. And that methodology is really kind of underpins, and I think what gives, I mean, for historians that are trained in the methodology, that's what I think gives them credibility. And not just that, but also not just parsing, one perspective, but really trying to look at the range of perspectives and developing an interpretive analysis from that. That's part of my thought.
Just add a little bit to that, saying that specifically I noticed in the 1619 project, and I'm going to use Nicole Hannah Jones's first essay as an example, there were numerous early American historians that she was summarizing and sometimes naming, and I've noticed in some of the best journalists, like Ta-Nehisi Coates, they frequently use the research that has been done by historians. For example, another area that I've looked at is redlining and housing segregation, and Tom Segru's book, Sweet Land of Liberty, and some others which are 400 pages long. Ta-Nehisi Coates gets that into an essay, and it does make it much more accessible. And one of my favorite journalists who has written recently is the book Slavery by Another Name, which I use in my classes. I use excerpts from the book and the film, and he's a Wall Street Journal reporter. So I think it can certainly be done, but it's a little bit different. You see some primary sources coming up, but maybe not quite as many as you would in a history book with footnotes.
Yeah, I'll just kind of looking at my notes here. I don't want to repeat what's already been said. I would mostly just agree with what Darryl and Monica were saying. I mean, I think one of the things that's really important about the difference between journalistic writing and academic history writing goes back to what Darryl was saying, is that often journalistic writing is much more accessible. It's written for a broader audience, and it's not so much engaging with very specific debates with other historians and kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of those debates. And so I think that is a significant difference. But fundamentally, what the 1619 project was doing is something that most academic historians also do, which is ask a new set of questions and sort of set a different origin point, or kind of question the periodization of how we talk about a certain aspect of history, to kind of bring to light new perspectives or shed new light on different perspectives. The other thing I would just point out is that I think the 1619 project is building on a lot of work of other historians, as Monica was just saying, and a lot of the controversy that kind of arose after it came out, I think was linked to some professional academic historians critiquing the project and saying that it had errors that it asked to be corrected. And I think that this got a bit muddled, because actually really what they're debating is not facts, it's the interpretation of those facts, which is really what historians aim to do, is interpret a set of facts. So absolutely a commitment to factual accuracy is shared by journalists and historians alike. And I think that really at the heart of this is kind of debates over interpretation, which is what historians get into all the time, but this has kind of taken it into a broader setting, a broader audience.
Great. Thank you for kind of setting up our discussion today with those opening comments. And now we would like to give you a chance to talk to each other about your thoughts, to kind of get you thinking. So we're going to ask you to group together in maybe 3 to 4 groups, or whatever feels kind of comfortable with the people around you, and discuss some questions that I'll propose here. And you can talk about whatever you'd like. And then we'll come back to the panel and have the panel talk more, and then we'll open it up for questions. So keep note of any questions that come to mind for the panel. And I also just wanted to quickly thank Rhonda Culbertson from IUSB. I forgot to mention her running the Zoom. Thank you, Rhonda, for doing that tonight. So in your small groups or breakout rooms, thinking about, why are you interested in history, or how do you usually engage with history? Where do you read history or learn about history, and what interests you about it? maybe talking about what has been your own response to the 1619 project, if you've read it or just if you've heard about it. And what is your sense of what historians do? Have you thought about that before, or maybe what do you want to know? What would be your questions about what historians do? And maybe you could pose those to our panel after. So we'll just take about 10 minutes. So if you want to group up, so the questions again are: why are you interested in history? How do you engage with it? What do you think about the 1619 project? And what do you think about what historians do, or what would your questions be about that? Go at it. I'm going to put a timer on.
Do this.
you. So, yes, chairs, thank you so much. You could just, I think, put them here, and if anyone wants to come up and sit on a chair. Sorry about that. We want you to be comfortable for the rest of the event, so it's an interesting shape of a room, but it does make it a little awkward to set up the chairs. So, all right. I think, yeah. Anyone else need a chair in the back? Yeah, at least a couple more. Sat about, yeah. Thank you, Chad. Thanks, Chad. All right, so thanks. Keep in mind any of those questions that you want to ask our panel. Now we will turn back to Darryl, Monica, and Katlyn. So if you could please discuss the goals of teaching American history in schools. That's a lot of the area that we've seen this controversy come up. What should be our goals for teaching race as a fundamental component of American history to children, and also for just thinking about American history in general? What are our goals for teaching or thinking about race as fundamental in that history? Again, a couple questions all built in here. How should we decide what to teach? And who gets to decide? And what is at stake when we make these decisions about what we teach and what we say about American history and race?
Okay, I'll start with this one. Yeah, so I think this question kind of cuts to the heart of a major debate that we're having in this country right now, and I think it kind of comes down to maybe two views, I would say. One is kind of, I think, the sense that the purpose of teaching American history is kind of to instill a certain sense of patriotism, or kind of instill kind of a national identity, and that it's just kind of a celebratory narrative, or kind of a narrative of progress. And then I would say there's kind of another view that says, no, the purpose is not necessarily that, but is to actually kind of look at American history without kind of an assumption of telling a story, a positive story that kind of goes in one direction over time, but actually kind of looking at it and looking at it more from a critical lens, to kind of teach students to think critically about the structures in society around them, how they came to be that way. And that would be, I think, kind of more in line with what professional historians kind of do when they look at history. So I think there's kind of these two different views about that. And I think that's kind of clashing right now, or there's a lot of disagreement about that right now. In terms of who should get to decide what we teach, or what the purpose of teaching American history is, I think that's also very much contested. I don't know that I have an answer for that. I think in some places, including in Indiana, actually, there's some efforts to say that parents should be the ones who decide this. State governments also in certain cases are saying, well, the government should be, the ones to decide this. I guess, you could say there's also a sense that maybe experts, in some sense, historians who have training should decide, or teachers should decide. And I don't think that there's really an easy answer to this, but just that we need to kind of keep in mind that the forces that do kind of decide what gets taught in schools have generally not reflected very well the diversity of society and of the students in schools. So we have to kind of think about that when we're thinking about who decides what gets taught in the classroom. So yeah, I don't have a great answer, but I think that, yeah, these issues are really important, and I think that's why people feel so much is at stake in these discussions.
Yeah, I'll add. I mean, I agree with all that, Katlyn. But I think that the bottom line is that when we teach American history, we need to teach the full history, and we need to teach the truth. Because the history that often we deliver to our young people is a sanitized, whitewashed history that fully erases, by and large, indigenous people, people of African descent, just to a large extent Asians, and folks who aren't from the European continent. And it's almost as if they didn't exist or didn't make any contributions, except in very, very exceptional cases. So, we'll learn about, I remember as a kid, I learned about Harriet Tubman, but I learned almost nothing else about slavery, and certainly not the real horrors of slavery. And so when we teach history, we need to make sure, I think in our public schools, we need to make sure it's age appropriate. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's really important. Like, I would not teach the history of lynching to a third grader, for example, but I might introduce that in high school, again, in age appropriate ways, because I think if we don't learn that history, we don't really get to know who we are as a people. And those who've heard me speak before have said, I've said, and it's what I believe is I study history not because I care about the past that much. I mean, I do, and I think the past is really interesting, and I love doing research. But I study history because I'm trying to understand our present. I'm trying to understand how we got here, how the world we live in today got produced. And so I've shifted some of my different areas of research based on that. Like, I study race a lot more than I did in graduate school, partly because that's a topic that's really significant in this historical moment. And people are asking these questions, and I want to understand it better. And so I don't think you can really answer the question of our present without having a historical understanding. I don't think it's the only way, and I think I think of it as necessary, but even if not sufficient. But it is absolutely necessary. But if we're going to have that historical perspective, we need to start teaching our young people that, kind of in school, that we need to teach the history of slavery. We need to teach the warts as well as, the wonderful things that this country's done. Because if we don't, then what we find, and I think this is part of where we are today, is we find that we are talking two different languages almost. We're operating from two very different realities. There's the folks that get the triumphant history, and that sounds all great and it's all rah-rah, America's the greatest country in the world. And then there's the folks and the folks who got left out of that, particularly people of color, indigenous people, and others, who have a very different reality, and both a different personal reality, but also a familial and genealogical reality. And they're excluded from that triumphant narrative by and large. And so those who are more interested in the second way that Katlyn laid it out, I think that was a good way. The folks who get to have the triumphant narrative and those who kind of have the more kind of critical narrative, they can't talk to each other almost. It's almost like they can't have a conversation together because their worldviews are so radically different. So we need to teach it in the way that we all learn, the good along with the horrible, and the horrible. And a lot of American history is horrible, and there's no denying that. And I don't think, can have any kind of national reckoning without owning it.
I want to speak for some of the teachers here. I'm a college teacher, as are the others who are with me on the panel, but a number of my students are going into social studies education, and they feel hurt and scared right now by the kinds of things that they're hearing from our legislature, that they need to be policed, that they've got to present both sides of the Holocaust or slavery, and they want to teach in different states than Indiana, maybe some that don't have some of these restrictions. And I know, maybe those bills are not going to pass, but I wonder if we would do the same thing, or if politicians would, I know they've done it with teaching evolution, in the past, we know the history of that, but would we be saying parents need to check out the science curriculum, parents need to check out the math curriculum? And thank you. I'm in favor of parents being involved, absolutely, but to have to post your lessons and ahead of time, before the school year even starts, is how that bill had started. These are ways that I think we take away dignity and just discount all the training that students are going through to learn how to discuss race. I mean, part of getting an education isn't just sitting in my history class, it's also sitting in classes where you talk about you're going to have diverse students.
I do so hate to interrupt, but I'm getting some messages that the folks on Zoom aren't hearing you.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
I think Darryl turned it. Yeah, I think that we have
think I had the microphone off, and I apologize for that to the folks on Zoom. Thank you. Yeah, so just to summarize for the Zoom folks, I want to speak for the social studies education majors and others who I think really care a lot about learning and are very dedicated. They're all going to be slightly different, and I think that's okay, but I think taking their power away from them, I think, is something that politicians are doing in order to gain points, and it's not the appropriate way to do that.
Thank you.
I'm getting a message saying that they heard you briefly and then stopped hearing you again.
Huh. Maybe, yeah, maybe we'll just. All right.
But I'll let you go on right now.
Okay. Thank you. So yeah, I think that brought up a lot that's at stake in these decisions about what we teach in school. And picking up on what you said, Darryl, about you being interested in history, not necessarily because you care about the past, but because you care about the present. Is that typical for historians? Would you say that most historians see their role more as researchers, interpreters, really focused on the past? Or is there a facet of the discipline that is more intentional about informing decisions and our actions in the present when we look at history? You want to begin?
Sure. Tell me the question again.
Do most historians, do you think, feel that way? Is that like a typical position of historians, that they're studying the past to inform decisions and actions in the present?
Well, I mean, and I'd be interested to see what Katlyn and Monica have to say, but I think that it really varies on the historian. I mean, I think there's some historians, who spend their entire life, their entire career, in whatever the area of history that they love, and they have these debates with each other, and they live, and I'm a 19th century U.S. historian. It's kind of how I would get pigeonholed if I was trying to find a job right now. That's what I have to put on my CV. And there's historians who spend their entire life in the 19th century, and what's happening today is not really their concern, because in their writing, I know a question's coming up. I mean, they're writing and having conversations with each other about whatever that point of interest for them. And then I think there's other historians, like I think probably those of us up here and some of you in the audience are more, I don't want to say activists, but are really concerned, really do have a perspective that history and historical study is an important part of not only just understanding the world that we live in presently, but also to changing it, and have a real commitment to using the information and knowledge to actually have an impact. So folks like myself, I give a lot of public talks about different historical things, because I think I really want to impact people, and I want people to be thinking about these things, because that information, and even for those who are in their little corners in the 19th, 20th, or 17th century, or 2 BC, or whatever their area of interest is, they still live in the present, and so I think that's important. But I don't think I think different historians have different motivations for why they do what they do.
I'll speak for myself. I've written a book, and in my book, I write in the introduction kind of where I'm coming from in the present. I'm in the field of African American history, but I want to be upfront about being a white person, a woman, and I was interested in the question of how do revolutions go backwards. I studied Reconstruction, and then the Jim Crow South and lynching and the era of white supremacy that followed that. And one reason is I grew up in the 80s.
I'm sorry, we seem to be
So,
having technical issues. Can you share somebody else's mic?
Okay, sure. Thank you. Give it a try.
All right, is this better? Okay. so I grew up, I came of age in the 80s, went to college in the 80s, and the 60s, had gone before. And I was interested in, what do you do when politics changes in your time, and you're still going on, you're still living, and what happens then? So I put that question out there, and I put, my own background into the introduction, not to give myself a pass on, just putting my opinion all over the book. I'm trying to find out, what happened in the past, reading the diaries, reading the letters, reading the newspaper articles, and asking questions, and then doing some interpretation. But I think it felt more honest that way, to be upfront about who I was, that, it's not being written from above. It's being written by a human being.
Yeah, I would say a couple things, kind of building off of these points. I think often historians do aim to focus specifically on the past, and there's an important aspect of taking the past on its own terms, right? So I talk with my students a lot about approaching the past as kind of a foreign land, in a way that we kind of take seriously ideas or sort of mindsets and social structures that seem very foreign to us today. And I think that's something that is empowering about history, because it lets you develop a sort of empathy for people who are different from you, historical actors in the past. And it also helps you see how certain things in society around you are not just natural. They haven't just always been that way, right? They kind of came to be that way over time. And so it's powerful in that sense. But as Monica and Darryl were both, talking about, I think that any good historian should acknowledge that obviously what they are, the kind of questions they're asking, the sources they're choosing to look at, that's all informed by the present that they are living in. Historians ask very different questions during the Cold War, for example, than they do now. And it's important, because sometimes that informs a historian's research, maybe even subconsciously. But I think any good historian will reflect on that, and be, should be upfront about that, and think about that. So that's kind of, as Darryl was saying, I think another way that history is empowering is to actually think about the present and the relationship between the past and the present, because it actually gives you a sense of how things came to be the way they are, and lets you think about possibilities for how they might be different, or how they might change in the future. So I think it's important to historians that history is not predictive of the future. It doesn't tell you what's going to happen, but it tells you a lot about how we got to where we are, and different possibilities about what could happen in the future. So that's kind of how I would think about it.
Yeah, it's probably pretty hard to completely separate, all concerns of the present when you're a historian. What about how historians work in relation to other historians? Is it really just building on each other, or is it sometimes, or commonly, kind of adversarial, or corrective, where people are kind of countering each other? Trying to kind of make a dramatic change? Is that something that usually happens in history? And then to bring it back to 1619 Project, if there's anything to say about how this relates to previous scholarship, how would you characterize all these readings? A lot of questions again.
Katlyn, could you speak to that? Because the origin story, I think what you were talking about earlier when we were talking, is a really good place to start the debate about where should we start periodization.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, so I like to think of, as a historian, that when you're producing work, when you're doing research, you're kind of entering a conversation with other historians. And it's a conversation that's been going on for a very long time. Hopefully it'll go on for a very long time after you say your piece in the conversation. But there are a couple different ways you can enter that conversation. You could say, hey, look at this that no one has looked at, right? You might find some new sources that no one's looked at before, or you might say, hey, maybe we should look at this group of people, or we could look at this event, something that hasn't really been looked at. And that is something that historians do. I would say more commonly, though, you're kind of building on the work of other historians, and often it's not necessarily that it's adversarial, but you are trying to find points of distinction or disagreement maybe with the way they've interpreted a certain set of sources or events that happened. And you can do that in various ways. One of the ways you can do it, which we talked about a little bit earlier, is kind of questioning the period that you look at or the framing of something, which is what the 1619 Project does by saying, what if we took this other date as an origin point for understanding American history? And what if we centered different perspectives and different voices in that story? How would things look different? And in that sense, the 1619 Project is building on the work of historians, and it is entering a discussion that historians have been having for a long time. And it is kind of putting itself in that conversation. So yeah, that's how I like to think about it. It is a conversation that's had over a long time through a lot of pages of writing and events like this where people talk about history.
And a lot of time spent in musty archives as well.
Yes, that's true.
But one of the things, just to add, and just kind of actually reiterate what Katlyn said earlier, like a lot of historians, just in the kind of contestations that happen between historians is often around interpretation. I think we can take again back to Trujillo, who wrote the Silence in the Past, who talked about there's the facts and then there's what we say, there's what happened and then there's what we say about what happened, right? What happened is kind of not that controversial. I mean, it's very bounded. It's generally there might be some disagreements about exactly what that was, but by and large it's bound. But how we interpret it, is a whole nother thing, and that interpretation changes over time. And I think exactly what Katlyn was saying, at different historical moments, we might interpret this differently depending on what's going on around us, given new additional information. And there's almost always going to be somebody who might disagree with you and disagree with that interpretation. So historians do go back and forth in that way as well. I mean, and a good example that's related to the 1619 Project is that how we understand slavery has radically changed, from professional historians. At the end of the 19th century, in the late 1800s through almost to the 1960s, slavery was portrayed as, slavery and Reconstruction was portrayed as slaves were by and large happy. White masters were by and large, kind and paternalistic, and that the institution itself was bad, and it's a good thing that we ended it. But it was a reasonable part of our history. That's a really oversimplification because there's some real debates about that. But coming out of World War II in the 1960s, and a lot of younger folks were veterans from World War II were going to college, and particularly more people of color were going to college, and more women were going to the university, and those perspectives started changing. More research was done, more sources were looked at. Previously, no one had really looked at slave narratives. Like, nobody really actually thought to, like, what did the slaves think about slavery? That wasn't really part of the narrative. But when people started reading slave narratives, that's a whole new set of sources, a whole new set of voices came to light. And that really changed the way historians understood that period. And so those are important distinctions. And so, kind of in that little middle part, there was a lot of debates back and forth from the old historians and the new historians and who was more accurate. And, the newer historians ultimately won because they had sources to lean on in terms of reinterpreting that period of American history. So yeah, and it was while it was kind of challenging the old narrative, it was also building on it. So I think it's a both and to a large extent.
I think that's a very exciting story to tell, the one about how historical writing about slavery changes. I mean, I remember this was something that we went over in graduate school, that Ulrich B. Phillips said the reason that we had slavery is because Black people can work better in the hot sun. And he was considered the leading historian of the time. And then in the 50s, I want to just add to what Darryl is saying, that there is also something that comes about the civil rights movement, and then you get stamps the peculiar institution. And then there's those who are saying, well, stamp hasn't gone far enough. We need to look at further. And there was a discrediting of the sources before then. Abolitionists were cranks. They were like crazy activists. They need to be psychologically analyzed. And slave narratives are just exaggerations and fictions. And you had to go in and prove that, you know, some of these things had really happened. So, for example, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs was as fiction written by a white woman. A black woman couldn't have written this source. So there's some real fights that go on to show that the story that had been told in the past was, we need to look at new sources, and these sources are valid, and they had to be researched and defended to get them to that point.
I would just add really quickly onto this that this change in the what we call historiography, what historians say about something, is absolutely true based on new sources and kind of thinking about sources in new ways. But as you can see, the debate over the 1619 project, there still are these disagreements among historians, and I think a lot of it boils down to, when we think about the 1619 project, this question of, okay, is slavery actually something that was central to the founding of American democracy, right? Is it something that's very central in the Constitution, to the Revolution, to American history? Or is it something that is kind of an aberration, something that is a contradiction, but not fundamental, you know, kind of on the side? And you can see in the controversy within the historical community over the 1619 project, that those debates are still live. You know, historians still have these kind of interpretive disagreements. So just to say, it's not a closed, you know, it's like we were saying, it's an ongoing conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to, thanks for that perspective on, you know, history is not fixed, you know, our interpretations and understandings are always changing. So as we go forward, you know, what questions should we be asking ourselves as a reader of historical information? This will be the last question before the audience questions. So, you know, as librarians in our information literacy classes, we kind of promote questions about the currency of the information, the qualifications of the author, the supporting sources, quality and quantity, things that you've mentioned. How does this author compare to others, the conclusions of other authors in this field? Is there a consensus? And is there some obvious bias or agenda? So if you have anything to say about, are those, you know, typical kind of questions, are those good questions? Are there additional questions, you know, maybe anything specifically to history that we should keep in mind, and any resources as a non-historian that would help us, you know, as to help us understand and evaluate as we're hearing kind of different perspectives on a question. Luckily, they knew the question.
I don't have much to add to this one. I think the librarians have a lot of good criteria already.
Yeah, I would say yes. I would defer to the librarians. I think they're you know, the experts. They've got it right. The one thing I would bring up maybe that is distinct to history is something that Darryl mentioned earlier, is thinking about primary and secondary sources. So historians work with both, but basically a primary source is something that was written at the time you're studying by a historical actor who's involved in the events that you're studying. And a secondary source would be something written by, you know, a historian or a scholar, you know, later after the fact, trying to understand that event. And that's an important distinction. But that said, I think there's some questions that we teach students as historians to ask when they look at a primary source that actually can be helpful when you're looking at kind of any source. There's kind of four aspects. One is to think about the origin of a document, who produced this document, whether it's a piece of writing or a piece of art or a song, anything really, who produced it, why did they produce it, what were they trying to do with that, the purpose of the document. So who is the audience for this? How might that audience have shaped what they put into this document? And then when you have those in mind, you can think about the value of the document. So taking those things into consideration, what can you get from that? What can you understand by reading that document? And sometimes that might mean you can kind of read between the lines. You might not take at face value everything it says, but you might think about what it's maybe conveying between the lines, that it's not so direct about. And then lastly, that can help you think about the limitations of the document. So if you're thinking about the reason it was produced, maybe thinking about certain biases or how the audience maybe shaped what people wrote in the document, you can think a little bit about where you might not want to fully trust everything the document is saying, or you might think about some of the limitations there. Those are just kind of some things that I think we talk about with students when they're encountering sources that I think is actually useful when you're reading pretty much anything.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And you know, what we also tell students is Wikipedia should not be cited. Even though what I also tell students is that Wikipedia is a good start, but you need to see where they're getting their information. Because I think that the most important thing is to really to question, and this is particularly important in our contemporary world because there is so much information out there, and you can get it from almost anywhere, from any perspective, is to really be thinking about what yeah. I think those 4 points are spot on in terms of like for anybody and for any document, but looking at what is the veracity of the source? What's that, and particularly again when we're highly charged political or socially contested issues today, and everything from January 6th and what the motivation behind that was to the discussions around the 1619 project, is making sure that the sources you have are trusted. And I think I can't emphasize that enough. And generally, like what I do is I almost look at 3 or 4 different sources, and I try to look at it from different sides. And then ultimately, your job is to be critical and make up your own mind about it. And I think one of the things that is sorely missing, and I think it's missing in part from our educational system, is learning to just be critical, to be critical thinkers, not just taking something at face value, but really kind of going through that list that Katlyn laid out and really kind of just thinking about it deeper. And that's a little more work is required because so much is just so easy to pick up and read, right? And then just go with it. But if we're going to really be good critical thinkers and ultimately, I would think, good citizens, we really have to do a little bit more of that work on our own, particularly given the medium and access to information is just so dispersed now.
Yeah, those are really good things to keep in mind. Thank you. So now we can take some audience questions. I think we're going to go back and forth, an in-person question and then a question on Zoom if there is one. And I'm just going to restate your question so that the people on Zoom can hear the questions in person here.
I have several comments. One is, I think, Darryl, you hit it on the mark. We have failed in our educational system to teach people how to do critical thinking. It just isn't happening. Look what's happening with our viewpoints about COVID. Okay, COVID vaccine and treatment. And then secondly, I'd like to point out that while historians use primary sources, you have to look at who's writing those primary sources. And frequently, the only people who had reading and writing skills were white men. And so if you look at viewpoints, and there's also some propaganda and other things that are moved in there that we don't really understand. So even if you look at the newspapers at the time, or somebody's diary at that time, or journals that were written at that time, look at what we know about the Vietnam War. It's all written from the American point of view. And what did they want? What did the politicians want us to know? But that America was winning. Okay. And then the third point I'd like to make is legislators are not just trying to tell teachers what to do. For years, they've been telling doctors and nurses what to do.
Okay.
And what you could say to a patient, how you could say to a patient, and what you could prescribe and what you can't prescribe, and for what,
Yeah, so just for the people on Zoom, just comments about how the audience member feels we failed in the educational system to teach critical thinking, and when historians use primary sources, you also look at who's writing that primary source and thinking about the people who had the skills for older sources were usually white men to read and write, and there can be a lot of propaganda in a primary source, so you have to take that into consideration, and that legislators have been trying to tell not just teachers but other professionals like doctors, what they should be doing, so it goes into other areas besides teaching. Hopefully that's a good summary. Is there a question from Zoom that you'd like to?
Yes, we have a question from Kate, and she's asking something related, is how do we better integrate the teaching of and opportunities to practice critical thinking into K-12 education?
Oh, all of us K-12 educators up here, right?
I mean, I would say that, yeah, I mean, obviously we are teaching college students, so, teachers who are actually in the classroom, K-12, are probably better qualified, to answer this than we are. But I do think that one important thing is to, in the way that we teach history, for example, but you could talk about this in other disciplines too, is to kind of talk about what we've just been talking about up here, which is how you approach a source. Back to your comment about primary sources and their limitations, but thinking about that and getting students to not just kind of take in information, not thinking about education as sort of pouring facts into their minds, right? But teaching them to engage with material and ask questions about that material and help them develop the skills to come to their. And so any way that we can integrate that, I think, is really important. And yeah, librarians also have such a huge role, I think, to play in that, in developing that kind of informational literacy and critical thinking skills, at younger ages, because it is absolutely necessary in our society where you're bombarded with so much information all the time to be able to navigate that.
Yeah, in in a previous life, I actually worked for a year as an administrator in a elementary school, which is actually why I teach college now, because I learned I learned that that's really not my space. But what was really interesting about it was it was a laboratory school that was doing some innovative, different kinds of educational models, where they actually had, I think, third through fifth grade in the same room. And what they really built on was using the kids' experience to teach. And because I think, as Caitlin said, it was really important, which made me think about this. Children aren't empty vessels. I mean, they come with life experience as well. They come with perspective. They come with, and how do we using that to help them become even better thinkers and more critical thinkers, but not relating to them as like tabula rasa, like blank slates, but really using what they bring into the classroom, and which I do as a college professor. But I think any good teacher needs to kind of think about that in the content that they're teaching in a way that's accessible and, again, age appropriate. Because again, if we're teaching history, and there's parts of American history that, it's not age appropriate to teach first and second graders. And you might want to hold off and teach that later, but you can teach them how to think about sources. How do you get your information? There's just all of these ways you can build, like building blocks, to help them become both better thinkers and better readers and better participants, in conversations and discussions and debates.
I had the privilege of also teaching in a primary school in New York City when I was fresh out of college and just had my history major. And I learned a lot of things from that type of teaching. Again, like Darryl was saying, that wasn't necessarily going to be my space, but I loved aspects of it. I love hands-on history. I think history should be taught hands-on in K through 12, and going to museums that cater to children and looking at an artifact and saying, what do you think that was? Or why do you think, what do you think if you're looking at an artifact, how does it seen from different perspectives? When you get to high school, you can start asking, okay, here's the Populist Party platform. How would a banker have seen this? How would a farmer have seen this? How would a black farmer versus a white farmer have seen this platform? And you start thinking about that history was lived by people from different perspectives, and it's not just one story that gets told and poured into heads, but there are many ways to look at these sources. Looking at what different historians say when you get to, the high school level. Here's one interpretation of the revolution, here's another. What do you think? What are the sources that they're using to create that? I mean, you can do this in other subjects as well, but you can certainly teach critical thinking with history writing, both primary and secondary. And I think it would make it come alive more and show more respect for students at the middle and high school level.
Okay, so for the Zoom, in regards to the 1619 project, what are some areas that you think it gets right, and what are some areas that are still debatable or being debated?
I'll start off here with just a broad statement, and that is that I think it's a great idea to look at the present and ask, how did it get to be this way? And that's something that the 1619 project does. And it's also really challenging, because to put all the dots together takes really a lot of documentation. So sometimes I found that, I would have liked a little bit more of that connecting information. And it is more, fleshed out in the book version versus the magazine. But I think it was so great that it got people asking that sort of question. Why do our cities set up the way they are? How does race factor into why we have super highways going through certain neighborhoods and not through others? And how did that all come about? Why is healthcare so harmful to people of color in many ways? These are good questions to ask, and then going backwards to answer them.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think that a lot of what it got right is asking these questions and thinking about these things in this new way. Maybe this isn't a very comforting answer, but I think in some sense there's not necessarily always going to be a right or a definitive, settled, true story that everyone agrees on, and there's complete consensus about it. So yeah, like I was kind of saying earlier, there still are a lot of debates among historians about certain interpretations that are offered, but again, I think it's important to say they're not debates about facts or factual errors or anything like that. They're really debates about interpretation. So I think that sort of gets to, yeah, it's a little uncomfortable because it's not necessarily right or wrong, but yeah, I think it'll continue to be kind of debated for a long time. And I think it's a valuable contribution to actually ask some of these questions and bring it to a wider audience.
And I think that the issue of it not being right or wrong, but I think that the 1619 project is very useful. And it's not right or wrong, but it's useful in multiple ways. And one is, I think, that the fact that it centers race as part of American history, like not as a part, but as a central part of American history, is long overdue. I mean, race just floats below the surface in so many contexts in this country, in politics, in economics, in healthcare, in education. I mean, the kinds of disparities in wealth, in health outcomes, and in life expectancy, like just in our daily life. You can't pick up a newspaper and not have, in some article somewhere, that race is going to be an issue somewhere, right? I mean, certainly in the last 5-6 years, well, maybe since 2008, since we had the first black president, and even more so, the race, it's, whether you think it's still a conflicted area of American history, or you think that we're past it and it's colorblind now, we move beyond it? Those debates are happening. And I think that what this project has done is really put that in the forefront in a really important and useful way. Kind of, I could possibly nitpick some of, her argument, but I don't need to do that. And I find it a really useful point to be able to have conversations with people, and that's a value in and of itself. And just by the way, that value can happen when people write ridiculous stuff as well. I mean, I was trying to think of something. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but something like totally outrageous, and you might get from the Heritage Foundation or something like that. But
The 1776
project, yes, that's a good
project.
Which I think I have somewhere in this folder. But if you get a chance and you do want to have one of these really good moments of like, how do you become a critical historical reader? Read the essay that Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote, and then read the 1776 project that came out of the Trump administration. Read them side by side and look at the different interpretations of American history, and then really critically engage both of them. I mean, I think that would be really useful.
Have several. The first being, and this one may be a challenge, from Virginia. When does American history really begin or start?
I'm going to give it to the colonialist first.
Yeah, I suppose by default I'll start because I work on the earliest period. But I mean, I think, yeah, that's another question where there's no one right answer to it, and historians all kind of offer different possibilities, right? The 1619 project offers one. We were talking earlier about how you set up a class about American history. Where do you start? Where does the class end? And so, yeah, you could say, American history starts with the Constitution being written in 1787. And that might work if you're telling a certain story about the American government or the rise of the federal government. But generally, I would say historians always just say, no, look back further. That's kind of our bias, is to say, no, but you have to go further back to understand, whatever it is that you're looking at. So yeah, I would say there's no one definitive answer. And in fact, after the 1619 project came out, there were a lot of historians who came out and said, well, actually, 1619 is not the first moment that enslaved African people were on the continent in North America. You actually have to go back further, and you have to look at the Spanish Empire, and you have to look at these other situations. So there's always, I think, different possibilities, and it depends on what story you're trying to tell, what you're trying to focus on, and what you're trying to explain. That's kind of what I would say. So again, no easy answer.
Well, and I think it's both the story you want to tell and also the questions you're asking. Like, what are you trying to answer? I think will determine that. Some would say, American history began when Columbus set sail, from the coast of Spain. I mean, you could argue that, I think. But whether you argue that or not would really depend on what question you're asking, and what is the story you want to tell. Is it about about exploration and discovery? Another shift on that might be conquest. Others might be, it really varies. I think that I agree totally.
Well, I'm going to put in another twist on that. I teach environmental history, and you want to go far back? Archaeology can tell us that human beings have been on this land where we are, for tens of thousands of years. So this is, an old land. If we look at indigenous history, if we look at the history of the land itself, that's another branch of history if we're asking a question about how geologically this area has changed over time, and what are the layers under the soil, under the water. So history can be this endless onion unfolding backwards and backwards and backwards. And you got to ask good questions. That's what what I think Darryl and Katlyn are both saying.
Speaking to your point about the usefulness of the 1619 project as a way to take a new look at our history and as a mode of bringing these conversations out amongst all of us, I'm wondering what other topics or time periods you would like to see the 1619 treatment apply to.
All right, great question. So referring to the 1619 project as being useful for having a new look at history and bringing out important conversations, what other topics or areas do you wish could get the 1619 treatment?
I would say, well, I've like five ran through my head. I mean, some have heard me say, like, I'm kind of reconceptualizing critical race theory and thinking of critical race history, and thinking about history, you kind of using that kind of methodology that critical race theory does. One area of American history I think we haven't critically looked at enough, and I think is forming of our present in almost as significant a way as labor history. And I think that the history of labor in this country. So when I started my graduate work, I was a labor historian because there was two questions I was asking. Like, one is, how did corporations become so powerful, and who thought they should be people? And how did they get 14th Amendment protected rights, and black people did? The black people fought for and still fight for. And the related question to that is, why is labor so weak? Like, why are workers treated so badly in this country? Why are we underpaid? Why do we have this class stratified system where the vast majority of people in this country struggle day to day, and there's no real safety net for it? And I think those two are related. So I think kind of a critical labor history would be a really valuable contribution, and I would love to see that develop.
It is hard to pick. I think for me, it would be the 1890s, kind of the worst time period for race relations, to see kind of where that went and how did we ever get out of it. And so that would be an interesting moment for me to look at.
And can you just one more thing about the labor history? Because why I think it's important is I'm pretty convinced that the white working class in this country have been screwed royally. And part of how race has been used as this wedge to keep a lot of white people from understanding how oppressed they are in the structures of the society, and that they have that, what Du Bois called that psychological wage of whiteness. But that doesn't feed your kids, and it doesn't guarantee you health care, and it doesn't mean that you're going to have a decent quality of life. And I think if we could, like, unwrapping labor history is partly a history of race as well. And the focus, and a lot of that focus can and needs to be on whiteness, not on the other races.
Yeah, I would just quickly say I think it's hard to separate things out, actually. So, yeah, I mean, I would say I agree. Maybe labor, capitalism, but also democracy, the way that has been structured and thought about and changed over time in this country, or even the notion of empire, or sort of what is colonial American history. When does that end? How do we think about that? But I think it's also tied up together that it's hard. Yeah, I'll have to chew on that. It's hard to think about separating it out into different things.
Zoom question?
Yes, we have one from Charlotte saying, can you address the issue of being uncomfortable with truth?
I'll start with that one because I've been teaching about race a long time, and I really want to hear what others have to say about it too. But I think it's really important to be prepared to be uncomfortable. And one thing that I tell my students is, we could all stay just like really comfortable here, or we could learn something, because I don't want to overwhelm you and just totally get you, your head is about to pop off. But I also don't want you to be so comfortable that you don't feel some of the pain that has happened in history. There are emotions that are really a part of this, and that's what makes it come alive. But I try to also create a supportive environment, saying, yeah, we are going to be feeling some things, and it's okay to sometimes you have to get up and walk around, outside and come back into the classroom, or maybe you want to journal about that or talk about it or process it. I try to create what I call a brave space where we can look at ideas that are different from ours, and where we can look at the experiences of people that might make us feel guilty about what our ancestors did. I hate to use that word guilt because I don't think you're necessarily responsible, but you're accountable. You need to know, you can't ignore it. So those are some of the ways that I approach that issue of comfort and discomfort.
Yeah, I would just build on that to say, yeah, learning and education is not comfortable. It is uncomfortable fundamentally, and I think that we have to be kind of honest about that and prepare our students to encounter things that way. And I think if you do that and you say, we're approaching this from a basis of respect, right? You obviously have a personal investment in a lot of these things, or you feel it that way, but also it's not personal, right? It actually is about taking yourself outside of a situation and looking at it. We say thinking historically, but thinking about it in a different way. And I think that actually the last point that Monica was making about this sense of responsibility versus accountability is really important, because I think actually if we look at some of these very difficult issues and this history, that obviously the effects of that persist in our society and it's still ongoing, but if we look at it historically, it actually should help remove some of that sense of personal defensiveness or guilt, because actually what it does is it shows how these things are structural over time, right? And that it's not about, a person being racist or something like that. It's about how these racial structures have been built into society, and that actually that depersonalizes it, or it should be able to have that effect, and it's important, and it's a point of accountability to reckon with that and to actually see that for what it is, and then think about how you play a part in that, where you're situated in that, and what you have a responsibility to do about that.
Yeah, and I guess I say in my less generous moments, I mean, I think, Black people have been uncomfortable with history for a long time, and so when the questions like that is like, how do you prevent people from from being uncomfortable? I just think like white people. That's a white person. That's a white people question. Because I mean, that's my less generous, but I do think it's true as well. Um, because no matter how you teach, like for the whole triumphant history that erases people. I mean, I certainly remember sitting in classroom in elementary school or middle school and high school, feeling uncomfortable. Like there's no Black people being talked about here, and so it's suddenly to say that. Okay, so I want to preface this. Let me back up. I agree with everything they said. So let me say that. But I also just want to be really clear that somebody's going to be uncomfortable no matter what you teach. And the question is whose uncomfortableness gets to be prioritized. And there was no backlash about nobody said anything about being uncomfortable about what's getting taught in schools until things like this came out. So I think we really have to note that when we think about it, and then do everything that Monica and Caitlin said, because how we teach this history, it's too important, it's too important, and it's not personal. There's races out there today. Most of them probably don't sit in my classroom. They don't take my classes. So I don't need to point fingers at anybody, about anything bad that's going on. But I really want them to push them to think critically. I want them to really own this history, that this is what produced us. This is why, I think I'm one of 6 African American professors at IUSB. Like that's not an anomaly. There's a whole historical process that created that reality, right? And that's uncomfortable. And that history is uncomfortable. It just by nature is. And we just have to be able to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, and not taking it personally, but really owning it. And I think, ideally, and may not be for everyone, but to figure out what do we do with that uncomfortableness now that we have it, now that we know it, now that we understand it, and understand maybe even where it came from. What's our responsibility to, maybe the next generation doesn't have to be as uncomfortable as we are, because we know better, and we're teaching better, and we're doing better.
We can take one more audience question.
All this stuff has been really, really wonderful. But one of the things that came up in something that Darryl said that I think we need to go back to about teaching this in public schools. And there's a dangerous kind of feeling among Americans that before all this stuff happened, all these black people and women and ruined our story, that we all agree but we have to remember, and I think that I find particularly in the Midwest that we get very uncomfortable with knowing that we live in a society that has always been characterized by intense political, sociological, ideological conflict. And this is not only about race. I mean, this is not the first time this has come about race, as Darryl referred to. You should have seen it in the 60s when somebody said, maybe black people belong there. I lived in Boston, where white parents threw rocks at little children to prevent them from learning black history, where a white teacher was fired from his job for teaching at Langston Hughes Club in the city of Boston. I'm not talking about Birmingham, Alabama. I'm talking about Boston, home of the Kansas State movement, right? So these fights have been going on for a long time, but they've not only been going on about race. We have, as long as the social divisions and social visions are different, one of the places we put it is what are we going to teach the children? But the reason I think it's dangerous is we keep looking back to this false past where we all agree. And there's a lot of that going on in America. Oh, what happened? We used to all get along. We didn't. We didn't. I was in school. And this is, I know, my students think that it's like, oh yeah, you were born during sort of the Greco-Roman period. So that's the past. I think I was born in the current period. I'm sort of defined by the fact that I'm still alive. And European immigrants weren't accepted. Protestant prayers were taught in public schools when I was growing up, even though there are many of us who weren't from that tradition. We have been fighting about these issues of who's in and who's out for us for a long time. So the triumphant model is not just, hurtful, which it is very much, but it doesn't reflect who is the left out. At the center, the fact that we have a society that still believes it can leave people out is the experience of African Americans. That you don't understand that, you don't understand anything. But it wasn't the only thing. And if we know that conflict's there, we can more readily address it rather than saying, God, good old days when we all agreed. Wasn't that wonderful? It wasn't happening. We didn't.
So I'll briefly rephrase for Zoom. I didn't get all of that written down, but just thinking about teaching in public schools, there's sometimes an illusion that before this conflict, we all agreed on everything, but that's not really true. There's always been intense conflict, and in the 60s, there was really violent conflict, such as white parents throwing rocks at black children, trying to integrate schools, and that the triumphant model is hurtful, and model of history is hurtful and doesn't reflect all of the groups that were left out. African Americans and also others have been left out of this triumphant model of history, and that we have to acknowledge that there's conflict before we can address it. I think we are pretty much out of time. Do you have any final thoughts you want to say to wrap up?
I'll just respond really quickly. I think it's an important point. I mean, it was a big point. I think it's a really important point is that there is not sort of this elusive consensus or agreement, and that a lot of that notion of agreement or consensus is based on exclusion, cutting certain people out so it doesn't matter if they agree with it because they're not included, right? So yeah, I just think that's really important. And I just want to gesture to there was a podcast in the recommended sources that I think was circulated that talks about that, specifically about the American Revolution, and says there's kind of this illusion that all these, even these white men who came together and wrote these documents, that they all agreed, and even they didn't agree, right? So I just think that's or yes, but really on a lot of things. So I think that's just really important, and yeah. So yeah, I just wanted to reemphasize.
Well, I want to say I'm really grateful that so many of us are here together. And I think that reading and talking to other people about the things that you read, history and other stimulating topics, is the way to have a lively democracy and a lively mind and a rich life. To me, riches are in community, and that's what we're having here.
And I guess to kind of put an umbrella over everything is that encourage everyone just to read history. I mean, and part of like this notion of being a critical thinker and really kind of taking that to heart, it takes work, and I think it's just to kind of own that. I mean, I used to say that if I want to find out what's happening in the world, I'll read the New York Times and I'll read Al Jazeera, and then I'll listen to another radio station, and to try to get different perspectives, and then I got to do the work to figure out which one do I trust and which one do I like. And it's a piece of work, but it's something that's worth it. I think if we're going to be fully developed as to our full capacity, and I think history is an important component of that work that we all need to do, partly because we've all been taught it so badly for most of our life. Then I think we have to seek it out, and then find, I think what Monica said, find people to talk with about it, because learning is always social, and being able to engage in conversation about the things you're learning, I think is one of the best ways to like really internalize it and to make it part of who you are.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great way to end. Thank you for being here and participating in this conversation. Thank you to our Zoom audiences. Thank you especially to our panelists. So, we have more events and discussions, as you know, at the library all the time. So please be sure to grab a calendar of events, a snack, or a drink.